Hey everybody, my name is Darren Calhoun and I'm coming to you live from Chicago. My pronouns are he, him, and I am somebody who is doing what I can to make the world a better place by answering a few questions and hopefully giving some context to what is going on in the world right now. If you've seen my previous 2.5 videos that have been just a conversation about what's happening, why it's happening, that's kind of where we're going to pick up from. I might be having some video issues. If my words are out of sync, leave me a comment and let me know that, and I'll try to fix that as we go. For context, where we are is that we have seen the. Oh wow, there's a loud explosion outside of my house right now. We've seen the death of George Floyd that happened in Minneapolis, where he was. Uh, okay, let me stop for a second. I'm having some video issues. Let me see if I can switch to another way. And hopefully this works out quickly. If not, then I'll do something a little different that won't be as pretty, but we'll make it work. Okay, words are out of sync. Okay, I'm going to do a little quick technical switch and I will be right back. Okay. All right. So we're back. Hopefully the video and the audio are synced up a bit better. If they aren't, let me know in the comments and I will try to keep going and fixing things at the same time, because that's what happens when you do things live. It doesn't always work the way you originally planned for it to work. So that being said, here we are. We are in the midst of, much better, thank you, appreciate it, Shannon. So we're in the midst of a whole lot of craziness going on. We've just had the harmful thing we experienced with George Floyd being killed at the hands of police officers in Minneapolis, and this was an extreme use of force. There's all kinds of questions around what happened. As usual, the police reports and official things don't line up, but then video comes out and everyone's outraged, because how could the police, the people we're supposed to trust, the ones who are supposed to enforce and uphold the laws that hold together the society that we live in, if they're not doing what they're supposed to be doing, how can we trust any of this conversation, right? And so people have been in protest and angry about that. We also have the killing of Breonna Taylor in Kentucky. She's a young woman who was in her apartment, her and her boyfriend in her apartment. Three plainclothes cops burst through the door with a no-knock warrant, and her boyfriend opened fire on the plainclothes men who just burst through her door. And in them returning fire, she was shot 8 times. The one of the worst parts of this tragedy is not only were the police not wearing body cams because they're plainclothes officers, the person that they were seeking a warrant for was already arrested by the time this happened. It did not. They had no reason to be in her apartment. They certainly had no reason to end up exchanging gunfire. Had they simply knocked, they could have had a peaceful exchange. But these no-knock raids are happening and taking lives all over the country. And another thing that is going on is that in the midst of these ongoing ways that black people are losing their lives, COVID-19 is happening, and disproportionately black and brown people, because of systemic issues with access to health care and underlying conditions that come from the ways that we don't have the same access to food, quality housing, and things like lead in the pipes, all kinds of things that disproportionately environmental pollution, things that disproportionately affect the health of black and brown people because we don't have access to health care. And on top of that, we're in a country that has been um, on lockdown for months, meaning 40 million people are unemployed, record levels of unemployment. The government has not had a strong and consistent message. It changes week to week. And granted, it's a pandemic. It's a virus that we don't know much about. But what has happened is people have been left at home, out of work, with no income, while rent has not been frozen, mortgages have not been frozen, universal basic income has not been implemented like the rest of the first world countries. And so instead, people have nothing left to do but to be home, to be angry, and to take it out in whatever ways they feel are best. And so you see that all these events have come together into the perfect storm where people have taken to the streets, where people are angry, where they're protesting, whether it's showing up not wearing a mask and carrying an AK-47, or if it's showing up with a Black Lives Matter t-shirt on and marching down the street. People are responding. And so what do we do? As I go through these things that I've been hearing, feel free to leave in the comments other things that you're hearing. I'll see them real time, and I'll bring a few of those on screen so that we can continue this conversation. This is interactive as best as I can. This isn't just about me talking, because y'all know I can talk a lot. So some of the things I've been hearing. The title of this broadcast: people aren't doing it right. And I think that's a very common response when we see things on the news, and we see people yelling, or we even see in the comment section on Facebook or on other social media, where we disagree with how people are responding to what's going on. Some people are grieving, some people are angry, some people are organizing, and all of us feel like everyone else needs to do it the way that we would do it. The reality is that's never been the way anything's worked. We all have different priorities. We all have different contexts. We have different abilities. And so one of the things that I want us to move away from is this idea that everyone is just going to magically align to the same method if someone just stands up and says it. It's never, ever been that way. Another thing that we hear, and this is an ongoing conversation, and I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it, we hear all lives matter. And yes, all lives do matter. But when all lives are not treated with equity, we can't get to equality. So many people look at laws and policies that are on the books, and they say, well, there's no law against black people. But they haven't looked at the way that policy works. They haven't looked at the way that hiring works or relationships work that give advantages to some people and don't give those same advantages to others. This is what we talk about when we talk about privilege. It's not simply, oh, you never had to work hard. It's not simply, oh, you just had everything handed to you. No, it's that you don't have the same barriers to things that someone else has. You might have been poor your whole life, and you might have had to work hard. But if you're a white person, no one's ever not given you a job because of the color of your skin. You may have been told, oh, well, the Mexicans are taking all your jobs. But 9 times out of 10, it was probably a white person who told you that. And so that was a blame shift. It wasn't actually that Mexicans took your jobs. They were given your jobs by capitalists who decided that they could do slave labor with someone else and say that it's their fault that you don't have a job. So let's not do all lives matter thing anymore. Another thing I'm hearing is people are saying people won't respect us because we don't respect ourselves. And what I'm hearing there is respectability politics. Again, when we look at history, what we don't see is that slavery started because black people were somewhere in Africa not respecting themselves. What we saw was that kings and queens and established nations were doing trade in 1500s, doing trade with Europe, and they were sovereign and independent countries, and that trade was the relationship that was normal. And yes, there were some forms of slavery during that trade, but it was not chattel slavery. What happened is that when people wanted more, when specifically Europeans got greedy for more wealth, for more produce, for whatever they needed, it shifted into this idea of moving into taking people as property in ways that took away their humanity. And so we got into chattel slavery. We got into the dehumanization of blackness at that point, which had never existed in history before. And so we didn't get here because we weren't respecting ourselves. And if we fast forward to the civil rights movement, the primary tactic of the civil rights movement was we're going to dress up in our Sunday best. They did the highest level of respectability that could be found. They did workshops and teaching people about manners and about how to speak and about proper ways of being in society. They did all those things, and they still shot Dr. Martin Luther King in the face. I say it so viscerally because we often underplay that Dr. Martin Luther King is the one they always weaponize against us to say, you're not doing it right. But it didn't protect him. Why should I believe that it'll protect me? So I really feel like the narrative of we need to respect ourselves so that they'll respect us. I think that comes from white supremacy. I think it comes from this idea that whatever whiteness demands of us, we need to jump up and give into so that we'll magically be on the page of now you're worthy of respect. The reality is that we were born worthy of human dignity, and that cannot be taken away no matter what we do. And if we treat every human as if they are worthy of respect, then that changes and informs what our criminal justice systems looks like. That changes and reforms what war looks like. We need to always hold true that everyone is worthy no matter what. Thank you. I'm like I said, I was going to try to throw some comments in there. So if you say something good, I'm gonna put it up on screen. Another thing that I hear often, and this is where some of y'all might get mad at me, the phrase "everyone needs to vote." And I am somebody who does believe in voting, and I think it's important. I think it's especially important in local elections where we have the most direct say over what's happening. But let's take that mantra to its end. Let's say that in November, everyone, 100% of the country that's eligible to vote, if 100% of them voted, and they all voted for the exact candidates that you picked, would racism end in December? Would it end the following year? When we say everyone just needs to vote, we have this idea that I don't think we've worked through, that everyone just needs to get on the same page, or everyone just needs to do their responsibility. But the reality is, racism is systemic. It's not simply people with bad intentions in their heart who hate black people or hate people of color. Racism is something that's in policy. It's in the laws. It's in the way we have bought our homes and the neighborhoods that we've built over generations. It doesn't go away simply because we vote the right person in the office. Right now, I don't like either one of our presidential candidates, to be very frank and honest. That doesn't mean I won't vote. That doesn't mean other people who are critical won't vote. It means we're having an honest conversation about the lesser of two evils idea that still leaves us with the evil vote. And so I want us to be thinking bigger and deeper than that. And I'm gonna try to keep this short, but I'm already going 15 minutes into this, and this is just the things I'm hearing. Another thing I've heard, we've had a couple days of riots throughout the country. All 50 states had protests. Many states had riots going alongside the protest or at the same time as the protest. I've always been very clear that rioting, protesting, the agitators, all of this gets mixed up in the same conversation, and it's not easy to draw sharp lines between who is doing what. What I do want to always say, and I'm going to do a separate video about this, We always say, well, Martin Luther King wouldn't do it this way. But Martin Luther King is on record. And there's a video that I'm going to use in a later video that reminds us. He said, we can't spend our time talking about people who are rioting when the entire history of this country has been a riot and a looting of black bodies. We can't keep telling people you're doing it wrong when they've been done wrong. And again, that's not to say it justifies anything, but it's to say we've been in a bad situation. Us being good in a bad situation doesn't make the bad situation go away. And so I want us to, instead of thinking about how it could have been, what can we do now? Grocery stores are gone. People are having trouble. I myself had to make special accommodations to order my prescriptions. That's real. And I do want us to do things like unite, like we always have. We've been a resilient people forever. And so, yes, that means we might have to carpool, and we might have to go out of our way to help our neighbor or help a vulnerable adult to get the medications they need, to get access to groceries. But let's, again, not forget. You say somebody said this, there's only one grocery store in the whole neighborhood. That's called a food desert. And the fact that the one grocery store could be burned down and there's nothing left, that was a problem long before that one grocery store ever burned down. And so I want us to really see what's been wrong, so that when we're upset about what is wrong now, that we look for a future where we don't have places that only have one grocery store, where people don't spend months and months out of work to the point that they would burn the one grocery store down. Yes, it's okay to be mad that the one grocery store is gone. It's okay to be upset that innocent businesses have been affected. But please don't forget that we didn't create the problem. We didn't create the society that made it so hard for people to be in business, that made it so hard to have healthy food and access in your neighborhood. That was planned. That was a choice by policy that's been reflected over generations. And I'm going to hit another couple points. I've seen some people say, and maybe they were joking, but they said, well, y'all didn't steal books. And I think that's kind of a way that people want to insinuate that people who are looting or people who are rioting aren't intelligent. Our history is full of people stealing all kinds of things as a way to overthrow and disrupt what's going on. For us to assume that people who riot or people who are angry simply are unintelligent, that doesn't really add up to me. I think if people did steal books, I don't think you'd be any happier. So I would love it if we just did not make that the talking point. Well, they didn't steal books. Well, if they did, what's supposed to happen? Let's use our energy to move into something, right? And so this is where I really wanted us to be. This idea of people need to get organized. I hear a lot of people saying that. Well, this thing wasn't organized enough. That thing wasn't organized enough. We have all kinds of ways that people are saying things aren't organized enough. Yes, 2020 vision, hindsight is 2020 vision, right? We know when we look back and say, oh, that should have been better. But I just want us to do a little thought experiment. If today, it's about a little after 2 p.m. here in Chicago, if by 7 p.m. tonight, you needed to gather 20 people who all agree on what should happen, gather 20 of them in person tonight, could you do it? How easy would it be for you to do that? I think even if it was just to go to get dinner, you'd have somebody who, well, I don't want to do that, or I don't like to eat here, or I've got an allergy, or I've got kids and I can't bring my kids to that place. There's all kinds of reasons that aren't because we don't care, because we're not unified. There's all kinds of reasons it's hard to get people together. So imagine in the midst of a murder happening, or imagine in the midst of people running to the streets who are angry. Imagine demanding that people already have a plan of action, a 5-point bullet plan of what's supposed to happen the day it happened, because you're seeing it in the news and you're seeing people in the streets. It just doesn't work that way. You can't organize that quickly. How are the grassroots community organizers who are probably already exhausted, who have probably already been working on reforms that you passed by and you didn't sign the petition for? How are they supposed to have all the answers ready for you already? One of the things that people say was Black Lives Matter doesn't know what they want. Have you looked at the Movement for Black Lives website? Have you looked and seen what the policy recommendations are? Do you know what police reforms are happening in your neighborhood with your specific police officers? These are the things that don't normally happen because we don't have to think about it. But then we have a major media event and everyone's trying to figure out, what do we do now? And all the stuff that we've been ignoring or didn't have time for, or oh, I don't feel like going to another meeting. That's when it shows up. So I want us to learn that protest is just the first step in an organizer's toolbox of things that they do. A protest serves an opportunity to get a lot of people aware of what's going on and to disrupt the status quo of what's been happening. So yes, we'll block streets. Yes, we'll sit in and take over a park or make noise in front of a lawmaker's home, because this is how we raise awareness when we've been ignored by using other means. And what happens after that is, it's not like, oh, we showed up, now the law's supposed to change. No, we show up as a show that people are interested in and care about this. And then we go on to the next steps. We go on to the petitions. We go on to writing new policy. We go on to involving people and building our database of folks who are interested in what's happening. There's all kinds of ways that we work together collaboratively, but it does not happen quickly. It doesn't happen instantly. And no, we all don't agree on how to make it happen. And so when you see a protest, you'll say, well, what did that protest do? Nothing is instant. You can't look at the civil rights movement and say, oh, they did that one march, and right after that one march, it was all done. No, there were lots and lots of things. They were marching not to end racism. They were marching to end discrimination in public housing. They were marching to end discrimination in hiring. They were marching to end discrimination in public schools. They were marching around specific issues that needed specific actions to be taken. But when we look back in history, we see, oh, they were marching for racism to end. And that's not accurate. And so it gives us this false idea that if we just go march about racism, that racism will suddenly end one day. And that's not what anybody involved was doing. It's kind of how we got told the story in children's storybooks. And so you get this last thing that I hear all the time, and I think it is well intentioned, but it is completely off base. We just need to come together. Wow, no one ever thought of that. I'm sorry. It's not that no one ever thought of coming together. Like I said, it's hard for you to organize brunch on a Sunday. Imagine what it's like to say, how do we dismantle racism? How do we hold police accountable? How do we get politicians who've been in their office for 20 years out of that office when they have money and they have power and they have people who are invested in keeping them in? All these things take a lot of work, and they won't magically bring us together, even if we all want to see change. And so I want us to look a little bit more at the history. I'm guessing this is going to go a little long, but hopefully you're still with me. And like I said, keep dropping those comments. If we look at history, I want us to look at a few things. Dr. Martin Luther King, like I said before, gets weaponized against us and is used as, this is your example. You're not doing what Martin Luther King would do. Everyone loved him, and that's why racism ended. I'm sorry. Some people think racism ended. Some people don't, but that's kind of the thought process, right? Martin Luther King was not well liked by a lot of people at the time. And I'm not saying white people just didn't like Martin Luther King. No. The FBI had a special relationship with a black televangelist who would get secret information, who would get things like, Dr. Martin Luther King is a communist. You need to preach about this. And so that would end up in his sermons. and he would stir dissension fed by the U.S. government. He would stir dissension against Martin Luther King. We were all familiar with the letter from the Birmingham jail that was a response to white evangelical preachers who were saying, oh, you're asking for too much. You're doing it wrong. You just need to give it more time. We can't desegregate right now. We can't give these demands right now. You're the one in the wrong. Meanwhile, we also know that the U.S. government had written letters trying to blackmail Dr. King and expose the adultery that he was guilty of. They were trying to expose the adultery, not because they thought he needed to be a more moral person, because they wanted him to end the movement. And we have to realize that all these movements don't just go away, they get ended. When they couldn't end the movement, they'll shoot the figureheads. And so I really want us to know that if you look up COINTELPRO, and I'll drop links after this video. This is on the FBI's website of the actual 15-year program they did to discredit Dr. Martin Luther King and other people that they identified as a threat to national security. We don't talk about that part of the history. And so we do get this kind of sunny, bubbly version of who Dr. Martin Luther King is and what his history is. But the reality is, if you're doing this kind of thing, there are people who do not want to see you live at any cost. And I don't want us to take that lightly. Another example of someone we get kind of overexposed to is Rosa Parks. We say, oh, she sat on the bus and she didn't make noise, and she was just going about her day and she was tired. No, Rosa Parks was a trained organizer. Rosa Parks was the secretary of the NAACP. Yes, she was a seamstress, but she was also somebody who knew how to affect change. Rosa Parks also was not the first person to get arrested for sitting on a bus when the bus driver said you have to move and give your seat to a white person. Claudette Colvin was the first person. She was a 15-year-old girl who was riding the bus with friends from school. And when she was sitting and her friends were sitting, a white person was standing between them because the seats were taken. And the bus driver said, you have to move. And she didn't. And she ended up being arrested at 15 years old. And in her testimony, she says that she felt the hands of Harriet Tubman holding her down and saying, don't go anywhere. So she was somebody who had, and she says her teachers and so forth taught her history so that she realized that there was something she could do in the midst of her oppression. We don't hear her story. Why is that? And this is another really important thing. We don't hear her story because not only was she a 15-year-old and the respectability politics said, she's not old enough, she's not the right image that we need to portray, she also got pregnant. And because they didn't want an unwed 15-year-old to be the face of injustice, they picked the more respectable Rosa Parks and planned that she would be the person very publicly arrested so that they could rally people around these protests that they'd been organizing. The optics and the way that media would react to this, the way that society valued certain people over other people, all that plays into who we hear about in the news and who we don't. And they knew that, and so they made very active choices. But to be clear, not every story gets news coverage. Not every protest gets a response. Not every injustice gets airtime. And so just because you haven't heard about it doesn't mean it didn't happen. There are lots of factors that go on that make this a thing. I always shout out Bayard Rustin, who trained Dr. Martin Luther King in nonviolent resistance and civil disobedience. Before Bayard Rustin, Dr. Martin Luther King had 2 armed guards outside of his house. Because of Bayard Rustin, Dr. King learned nonviolent resistance. Bayard Rustin, most people don't know about because he's not mentioned in most of the history. but he's the one who organized the Civil Rights March on Washington. He's the one who taught King. He's also a Christian man, a Quaker, who was gay and openly gay. And it was because of him being gay and getting arrested for accused indecency that just recently they post mortemly pardoned him. He was a threat to the movement. And so he was kept in the background. He was kept off the main stages, as he spoke at many things, but he was kind of kept out of the story. And so when we think about who is making justice happen, it's been all kinds of people who were the outcasts, people who were furthest at the margins. Black Lives Matter was founded. Two of the founders are queer women. We right now we're not hearing about the trans man and the trans woman who were just killed in the last few days. We don't hear about the people who suffer the most. We hear about the people that we like. And I really want us to realize that the main ones doing the work are the ones that are furthest at the margins. We don't hear about, we're starting to hear more about Marsha and the queer women of color that started the Stonewall uprising. I've got my pride flag up in the background. This is June. We're celebrating Pride right now, but we don't hear those stories. And movies have even been made where they had a cisgender white gay man as the protagonist for the Stonewall riots or the Stonewall uprising, and we know that's historically inaccurate. So I want us to realize that the stories we've been told often are not in reality. And so it makes us feel like we're waiting for the right hero. We're waiting for the next Martin Luther King. No, it's probably somebody just like you who is going to be the reason that change happens. So I've torn down a lot of ideas. What does it look like to make change happen? I've given a small outline of what the cost of this is. The civil rights leaders were murdered. Like, I want us to sit with that. They didn't just die. They didn't just give up. They were murdered. The leaders of the Black Power movement were exiled or killed, often in no-knock raids, or they had to leave the country just not to end up in the justice system that said that they were a threat for doing things like starting the Black Panther Party, who started feeding children in the neighborhood or escorting people to make sure that they would not be harassed by police. And when I was growing up in school, I thought the Black Panther Party were the bad guys. I didn't get the story that they did all these great things that we rely on today. Those parts were left out of the story. If we look at Ferguson and where Mike Brown was killed, and where we saw media coverage that made it look like black people were just losing their minds. But if you actually go to Ferguson, as I did, and walk through the streets and see people who are smiling, and it's a suburban little quiet neighborhood, and you find out that there was a story that was going to be a hot story to sell, but it wasn't reality. People are still kind. The shop owner who they said that Mike Brown allegedly stole from, he's a part of the community. He's somebody who's beloved in the community. The businesses in that community that were a part of the community and beloved by the community, they didn't get burned. Big corporate places that had never engaged as a part of the community, those are the places that burned. I can't speak to what got burned and didn't get burned in this current round of rioting and protest, but I can say that our relationships to the community really do matter. And there, again, is something that happens when we care about each other and we dignify each other rather than capitalizing on each other. Thank you for sharing this note about Fred Hampton, who, again, that's a Chicago name. There's a mural of him down the block. We've been killing the leaders of movements for a very long time, and it's not a secret. It's just nobody told you about it. So I give that as the precursor to what it means to get organized, because this is the kind of work that me, as a believer in Jesus, it costs your life. And it can affect you in all kinds of ways, and I don't want to take that lightly. But I think it's worth everything we have to seek out our liberty and our freedom. And so, when it comes to steps that you can take, find out who the local community organizers are in your neighborhood, in your town, in your city, in your region. There's people who've been on the ground for months and years before this, who can barely get people to show up at a meeting, who can barely get folks to follow the page, but who are doing the active work of holding police accountable. Right now in Minneapolis, the organizers who did work and had a victory in 2016 to get a law on the books where if a police officer does not intervene when they see another police officer going beyond their roles and responsibilities, in 2016 that became illegal and something that could be actionable by the authorities. Because of that work that happened by organizers in 2016, they were able to arrest the other 3 officers in 2020. But you didn't hear about it in 2016 because nobody really was paying attention. It wasn't going to be a national news item. But that was the work of organizers. Here in Chicago, we didn't have a trauma center on the South Side, even though that's the largest part of our city, and that's where the majority of violent crimes that would need a trauma center were happening. And grassroots community organizers fought for that for years. Even though there were university hospitals on the South Side, even though there were all kinds of other places that simply needed to add the service, community organizers protested, took to the streets for years, and we got a commitment to see that open. So it's not that things can't happen. We just need to support what's already happening and find out what's going on. If you've never been to a protest, I do encourage you to go as long as you're safe and able to do so. Find out if someone you know goes, go with them. It can be confusing and overwhelming to go by yourself. If your church or a church that's near you is going to participate in a protest, that's probably a good place to get started. You want to go and don't just go and hold a sign, but go and meet the organizers. Find out who's planning, who organizes, who called this protest together. You want to know that information so that you know that it's a trustworthy thing to be a part of, and so that you can know what next steps to take. Because the 20 people who organized it probably can't address and reach the 200 to 2,000 people who showed up, but you can go seek them out, and that'll be a great way for you to take a next step. Police accountability measures are always in progress in your vicinity, wherever you are. If you look at what the police unions are resisting, that gives you a very good idea of what real accountability would look like. Chicago has been working on all kinds of reforms. One of the things that I'm really happy about is we were able to change the bail system in Cook County jails, where I-bonds are essentially a no money bail option, because too many people are in jail not because they've ever been convicted of a crime, but simply because they can't afford to pay to get out until they have a court date where they can be proven completely innocent. So they can sit for months in a county jail waiting for a court date, only to lose their job, to lose their income, to be cut off from the community, to be given this perception of being guilty because you've been in jail for 6 months. And the only reason that they're there is because they couldn't afford $30,000 to be bailed out. That needs to change. We found that we were able to reduce the jail population by 16%, and that in that time we did not have an increase of violent crime, which means that the safety wasn't compromised when we let people out of jail. They were just in there because they couldn't afford to get out. So find out what's happening, what kinds of very tangible, very present things like that are going on that can make a difference. And I'll drop a link to that as well. Excuse me. Lastly, for folks who are in Chicago or near Chicago, check out local organizations. Every video I try to shout out a few. My block, my hood, my city is a organization that is showing up on the South Side and possibly other areas where they are doing work where they're directly responding to people who have lost because of violence that happens in the neighborhoods, where they're working with city organizers and city leaders, where they are meeting the needs of folks. Go check them out, see what they're doing, and figure out who's doing that in your neighborhood. And if no one's doing it, how you can start it. Lastly, something that is critical to formative my formative years as an organizer was Cure Violence. This was a program that took the idea of violent crime as a public health issue and treated it the way you would treat a pandemic or a virus. And so the same principles, who was affected, who was around, tracking who was impacted and who's most likely to become affected by the violence, because the people who are most closely impacted are the most likely to become violent as a result. We don't have trauma for people who witness a violent crime, or trauma therapy for people who witness a violent crime. We expect people to go to work the next day and go to school the next day and act like everything's okay. So Cure Violence instead stops that process. It goes to where people who are connected to the ones who experience violence and make sure that they have what they need and make sure that they don't go out and commit more violence as a result. And it's often run by people who were former gang leaders and people who were formerly convicted of crimes. You're like, well, that sounds great. Does it work? It it literally works in every city in the United States that has implemented the program. The problem is politicians like to say they're hard on crime, and so hiring ex-convicts or hiring people who were formerly incarcerated or former offenders, hiring people who don't look respectable doesn't win you election votes. Funneling money into programs like that doesn't win you election votes. What does win you election votes? Saying I'm hard on crime, saying 3 strikes you're out, saying we're not going to tolerate these hoodlums doing these kind of things. I'll say I was very hard on Lori Lightfoot, and I continue to have a very critical eye and watch what she does. But I'm glad that in the wake of the protests and specifically the riots and the destruction, that she chose to have a compassionate response, to acknowledge people's anger, to not say we're going to prosecute to the fullest extent of the law. She didn't go that route, and I'm very proud of her for doing that. And I want to see more leaders who have an empathetic and a trauma-informed response to what happens, to violence, to the reasons why people steal. When people have what they need, when they have proper family supports, and when they have care, and when they have access to the things that they need, they're not violent. We already know that in countries where there's a smaller wealth gap, that they have less violent crime. Where there's a greater wealth gap, people will steal everything. And the United States has one of the greatest wealth gaps. So if we want to see change, change is entirely possible. But we have to learn from our past. We have to learn what's been going on and how we got to where we are. I'll continue to make videos. I'll continue to answer questions. If you're not sure what to do, I want you to know that there is something that you can do. And if you are somebody who is a believer in a higher power, or even a Christian and believer in Christ, then I really want to encourage you that the same Christ who was a brown man and born into a minority and persecuted community in the Middle East, the same one who was put to death by the hands of the state and at the influence of political religious leaders of his day, is the same one who informs this mission, that we should seek justice, that we should be people of love and people who bring peace, not by ignoring and not by playing nice, but speaking truth to power, speaking up for the oppressed and the marginalized. And so thanks for hanging out with me. Like I said, I'll continue to drop links in the comments after this video ends. And if you, I like to, when I can, send you out with something to think about. So my band, The Many, we record music that is progressive, it is Christian, that it has an eye toward justice, and that hopefully is acceptable to everyone out there. And so I'm going to leave you with this song. And like I said, if you have questions, I'll be in the comments after this video ends. And thank you. You matter. What you do in the world can make a difference. So let's let justice reign.
Tonight, the streets are crying tonight. One more bullet found its way, one more life gone today. How do we change the ending of this story? What can we do to make it out? Let justice reign. Let it pour on this dry ground. Let mercy run. Let it flow where hurt is found. Like a river through the streets, like a flood with waters deep. Right through our hearts, straight through our hearts. Let it rain. Let it rain. Let it rain. Let it rain. This town's gone mad tonight. My heart feels bad tonight. The words they fly back and forth. Head down, defend your turf. We all want to stay alive. Just trying to get back home again. But how can we possibly survive? Let justice reign. Let it pour on this dry ground. Let mercy run. Let it flow where hurt is found. Like a river through the streets, like a flood with waters deep. Right through our hearts, straight through our hearts. Let it rain. Let it rain. Let it rain. Let it rain. And not one more. Enough is enough. Say their names. Enough is enough. Not one more. Enough is enough.